So before we get into what you actually teach at URI and your background and that type of thing, I read on your bio on the website, on URI's website, that you're a martial artist, which I have to address because I'm a martial artist as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean it'll be 30 years next month in fact.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, no, I got into it when I was a kid, and I've just basically done all kinds of forms of jujitsu, right? Aikido, Aikido Jitsu, BJJ, Kapop, Kempo, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I started more in traditional martial arts in, the early 90s. And I'd say over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, I've been more focused on first MMA, and then, lately, maybe the last 5, 6, 7 years, more focused on, kind of like, real life self-defense type of deal. So, yeah, no, it's fun. And I was, of course, a little set back by the pandemic. Couldn't train as
Sure.
much, but my main training partner and I, we managed to train through most of the pandemic. Of course, we both wore the masks and everything, and doing either KN95s or N95s, which, it was super hard to train in mass, especially on the ground. I mean, just the wrestling, is out of control. But after we were able to jettison those after we were both vaccinated, and man, I tell you, the cardio is so much better. It was awesome. So, but
Yeah, that makes a huge difference. I wish I went to Rhode Island College, and I wish I had a professor that trained some MMA. That'd be pretty cool.
it's fun. I mean, I for a while I was teaching a self-defense class at the university, again before the pandemic.
Oh, wow.
And that was fun. I had some students in there that were also in my academic classes. Not as much as I thought I would have thought I would have had. I don't exactly know why, but I think a lot of people get kind of, a little, they're a little wary, right, of
Right.
particularly in sort of MMA type of stuff. They think we're going to beat the crap out of each other, and that only happens when you really, really have someone you trust, and you're like, okay, we're
Right.
going to pull real hard this time, but
Yeah,
it
yeah.
doesn't look good. I mean, I've come to class with busted lips and that kind of thing. But,
Right, right.
yeah.
Don't talk about Fight Club, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, it is a common misconception that a lot of people, for people who haven't done it before, you can totally roll in with beginners and work with training partners who aren't gonna, slaughter you.
Exactly. And I mean, you want people to come back, right? I mean, because I remember, particularly in the 90s, we'd have what MMA, I mean, the UFC was getting started and stuff, or getting popular, I guess. We'd have people come in all jacked up by it, and yeah, you go a little bit hard, and a lot of them would never come back again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I trained Kempo for, I think, from when I was 5 until I was around 19, and that was a school that like prided itself on being really, really hard. So when I transitioned into like MMA training, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and boxing and Muay Thai and that type of thing, and they're wearing shin guards, and they're wearing helmets and more or less being cordial to each other, I was like, wow, this is different. But it really is. It can be a welcoming environment if you go to the right school.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as you get older, I mean, it takes me a lot longer to recover. I mean, if I pull, muscle or whatever, I mean, I could be several weeks, before I'm back to full speed. Right. So.
Right. Yeah, it's a good thing to keep as a lifelong hobby, I would say.
Absolutely. No question.
Right. So, you're a professor at URI, which we more or less established, but your specialty is indigenous people, Native American type history?
Yeah. So yes, that's my primary specialty and primary focus. I was trained in graduate school both in Indigenous history as well as early American history. More broad early American history. But yeah, my focus is really on Indigenous peoples in the Northeast and looking at how Native peoples have contended with what we call settler colonialism, which is a colonialism marked by permanent settlement of non-Indigenous people, and then secondly the subordination of those Indigenous people that occupy the land or live in the land prior to colonization. So my work really looks at how do Indigenous peoples or how did Indigenous peoples contend with settler colonial forces. In particular, I examine how Native peoples maintain distinct Indigenous identities despite either fundamental cultural change that's brought on by colonialism or genocidal forces brought on by colonialism, such as the Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, as most people know as the most common example of that. So I recently published a book that examines again this question in detail, and the answer I basically argue for in the book is that what Native people have done to, maintain and regenerate and reproduce indigeneity is to infuse Native ways of living and being into new cultural structures that they adopted or were forced to take on by the presence of a dominant colonial society. So that can, concretely, as an example, that looks like Native peoples who, for example, start to use the language of race, right? Who start to develop racial identities as either Native or Indian, et cetera, but do so in ways that are connected to longstanding and older Indigenous understandings of kinship, for example. And ritual kinship, so the making of a racial identity through an Indigenous structure of connection and relationship built on ceremonially produced and reciprocal exchanges of between either two groups or two individuals. So things like this, or Natives who, for example, get involved with Christian missionaries, right? And build alliances with Christian missionaries through mission stations or missions within Indigenous nations. So, I'm really in the book arguing not only that Native peoples regenerate Indigenous identity and Indigenous communities through this practice, but that the practice is authentically Indigenous because it is built again on longstanding and fundamental Indigenous ways of being in the world, right? So that the way they think about their place in the world and the world structure at large is, a universe built on interconnection. And that doesn't change from, let's say 1400 to 2021. And so it's that continuity through time and through the trauma of colonialism that it remains intact, right? And that is one important way that Indigenous people today, and then again in the book, I'm looking at the 18th and 19th centuries, but Indigenous peoples from those eras are connected directly to both their ancestors and their descendants.
Interesting. So you're basically examining how Indigenous people are able to, I guess, more or less assimilate with maybe, like you had mentioned, Christian. They do a lot of work with the mercenaries and that type of thing. You're saying that their actions, the way that they do this, is actually helping them realize their roots and where they come from?
Well, not exactly, right? So it's not that they're okay. So assimilation is the kind of model that the settler society uses, right?
Right.
And so the idea with assimilation is that Native peoples are going to lose their, their indigeneity, right? This is a form of colonial erasure, right? So it's the idea of getting rid of Indianness in ways that are not built on solely, either genocide or violence, right? So the kind of violent extirpation of indigenous peoples that you see, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, with the United States expansion, to the West Coast, right? That's one form of this either subordination or erasure of indigenous peoples, but it's not sufficient. In other words, you can't just go and kill all the native peoples, no matter that was tried, obviously, in certain circumstances. But you can't really do it effectively. And you can't effectively just simply remove them geographically again, even though that was tried. So following on or concomitant with those sorts of efforts are other efforts at, what you said, what was called assimilation or improvement in the 19th century. And this was the idea that natives were going to, again, lose their kind of indigenous cultures as they became, quote unquote, American or part of the United States, et cetera. Gotcha. And so that process, is kind of the lens that most Americans today are taught to see indigenous history from, right? But it's deeply, deeply problematic because it assumes this kind of loss of authentic indigeneity. In other words, it's hard for a lot of non-native peoples today to understand how and why contemporary native societies are in fact truly native when they do things, when they have things like Christianity in their community, when they speak English, when they work for wages and are part of the economy, all that kind of stuff. There's this kind of caricature of natives as pre-modern in ways that are meant to kind of lock, true or real indigenous peoples into the past so that you don't have true or real or authentic indigenous peoples in the present. And by doing so, that's a strategy that allows for the ongoing kind of, colonial processes that we experience today in the United States. In other words, there are no Indians because all the real Indians died, right? This is a really common myth. Or all the real Indians are gone because they don't live like Indians anymore. And what I'm trying to show in my book is that is totally incorrect, right? That while there is obviously fundamental cultural change amongst indigenous people, that the way they see the world and the way they act in the world is basically the same on a fundamental level, right? As it has been for thousands of years. In other words, for example, Native people still live in a world in which the basic fundamental building block of the universe is relationships and interconnection, right? Rather than something like individuality in terms of the dominant culture. So the difference would be something like, power, health, the kind of fundamental driving forces that affect the world, those arise out of relationships and connection rather than arising primarily from the actions of any one given individual. So so that is a basic native way of understanding the world, broadly native way of understanding the world that is still fundamental and intact today. And so what I tried to do in the book was to kind of draw a history that shows why and how that's true. because that history is mostly not present in the academy today, particularly in the discipline of history. You see it more in things like Indigenous studies or ethnic studies, that kind of stuff. But again, mainstream history has been slow on the uptake for this perspective. But it's vitally important for all kinds of reasons. But the one that I'm most interested in is really, again, helping to support Indigenous people in the present by writing a history again that shows how and why their indigeneity has remained intact again, despite the horrific forces of colonialism that they've experienced over the last several hundred years.
Right. It really is it's a testament to how strong the people are, that they're able to still express themselves in different ways. For example, I have a friend who showed me a Native American music group. I think they're called Hallucination, which is a funny name in a sense. But it was interesting to hear them over more or less contemporary musical, sounds and production, but they're still doing a lot of the traditional Native American style of singing and chanting and that type of stuff. And that was really interesting to see that, and it's a testament to what you're saying. And you also touched upon something that I wanted to bring up, and that's the fact that a lot of us don't know anything, or we don't know much about Native Americans at all. Where, for lack of a better term, what we're taught is very much whitewashed. We're taught that, Christopher Columbus comes and he's a help at first, and then but it kind of just dissolves. It kind of, there's really nowhere for us to go unless you take a real liking to it and you really do want to learn more. But like you said, it lacks in history.
Yeah, I mean, and that's on purpose, right? I mean, that it comes from the idea that if you really, understand what Indigenous history is, particularly in relationship to the history of the United States, then it leads us to an uncomfortable position, right? Which is, to put it bluntly, is the idea that U.S. civilization is to a large degree built on Indigenous land, right? And of course, Black slave labor. In other words, the way in which the United States unfolds as a civilization, the way it gets born and then unfolds as a civilization, really requires Indigenous land, right? Just in the very naked material sense. So in other words, if you are creating this liberal civilization, and by liberal I mean the idea of a civilization in which the individual is freed, from obligations to other people and duties to government to self-improve, right? So the kind of classical liberalism that the United States is built on. Well, that requires resources, right? If someone wants to go out and improve themselves, then it requires resources and the economic resources. And other than labor, the main economic resource at the beginning of the United States was land. And so you fight this horrifically bloody, war against the British Empire on the promise that when or if the Americans win the war, that they will create a new civilization which is focused on, predicated on this liberal premise. Then you need the resources to make that civilization possible. And Indigenous land is again, along with Black slave labor, is the main resource that is needed. And so if you tell the story that way, that makes a lot of Americans uncomfortable at best, right? Because there is this recognition of just kind of, like I said, the the physical necessity of this kind of genocidal process against Native peoples, and we don't want to, as a civilization, we don't want to really recognize that. But my point of view personally is that if you are going to improve things, right? If you want your civilization to be better, you need to know what the problems and issues are. And so, without knowing that, how do you fix something, right? I mean, like, if you take, I don't know, I tell this example to my students, right? I mean, if you take the Pats, for example, right? If they had a really crappy defense and someone came along and said, hey, look, this is what's going on with the D, here's how you need to address it. We would embrace that because it improves them, Right. So something similar has to happen, I would say, with the United States. You need to understand, or we need to understand, what the kind of fundamental and ongoing processes are that lead to the issues that we had in the past and continue to have in the present. And so the reason why, again, we don't get taught broadly the history as it, in a more kind of truthful light, is because it would make us have to then reevaluate, both, who we think we are as Americans, as well as how we live in the present. And that's just, that's deeply, deeply uncomfortable, but I would say cathartic, healing, and necessary, necessary for the good of all of us, not only, Indigenous peoples, but all of us. So, the idea tends to be that what we did to the Indians, right, was horrible, but it's, again, locked in the past. And there's nothing we can do about that now. And that's just simply not true, right? I mean, in other words, there are still Indigenous peoples today, and the fact is that the dominant society still holds most of the land that used to be held by Native peoples. So in that very simple way, colonialism is ongoing, right? And that doesn't mean that we, need to have some sort of like reverse genocidal process where all non-Native peoples are kicked out of their homes, that kind of thing. But it does mean that we need to understand why that process happened, how it continues to, unfold. And we need to start asking again, tough questions about what do we do about that now? So that kind of historical connection between past and present in a way that is more sincere and genuine and accurate is super important to that process. And again, as you said, the whitewash history that we're taught impedes and in fact, forecloses on that possibility really by locking in colonialism into the past, or locking, again, authentic natives into the past. And so again, in my, my own writing and then in my teaching, I try to uncover these kind of, fundamental mechanical processes in American civilization and in Indigenous history that we need to understand to be able to start to, again, improve our society. And in ways that are helpful to all, right? To all people on this land. But of course, super helpful to Indigenous people.
Right. What's interesting about a lot of these causes is some of them end up going mainstream. And we have this idea of, white guilt that has been brought. It's come more to light with a lot of the BLM movements and the LGBTQ movements and that type of thing. And I support all those. But if we're being honest, there hasn't been a major play when it comes to Native American awareness. There's nobody there's nobody attributing their white guilt to what we did to Native Americans so many years ago. It's rooted somewhere else. Just off the top of my head, Marlon Brando seems like the only guy who said anything about Native American people. And it is unfortunate because there's so many other things to there's so many other ways that you can expound on different people's problems and their strife, and just bringing it to a new light helps. It definitely helps, especially when it gets to such a mainstream platform to where corporations are using it.
Yeah. I mean, right. I mean, and that's what our civilization does. It commodifies everything, that is a huge issue. Kind of picking up on what you said. I mean, I'm really in terms of what you said in terms of guilt, right? I think there's enough blame and et cetera to go around. I'm not to draw I'm not trying to draw some sort of false equivalency between, indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples. But in other words, we understand what happened, right? We understand the culpability of non-indigenous peoples in those processes, like I said. I'm much more interested now in ways of connection and unification amongst groups that are working for, again, positive and revolutionary change. Things that are going to not become co-opted by or at least will be able to better resist being co-opted by powerful forces, because they're so widespread, right, in terms of their support. So I am always kind of looking for allies, and I don't really care, what kind of racial identity you think you have, or what kind of class identity or gender identity or any of that kind of stuff. I'm interested in, do you want to, help to create something better, particularly in a time, in the time that we live, right, where we have all of these, kind of horrific intersecting crises, political crisis, right, economic crisis, social crisis, the obviously ecological crisis, the pandemic, right? So we have all of these intersecting crises, and it seems overwhelming and exceedingly dark, right? But in this kind of ironic way, it does open up possibility and opportunity for, again, positive change. So that, in other words, if we kind of start to move away from these kind of negative positions that we're taught to inhabit, particularly along, kind of some sort of zero-sum model. In other words, if I'm going to do well, it means you have to not do well, right? If we can start to move away from that and move more towards connection and working together to improve things, in ways in which we're sharing the stuff that we have, whether it, again, be material resources, social resources, or anything else, political power, whatever it happens to be. I think we can resist that kind of co-opting process that you mentioned. So again, especially in my courses, I really try to hammer home the idea that, this is not about you or your mother or your father or what they did and what they have. We understand those processes, and we understand why there has been this kind of disproportionate advantaging and disadvantaging of different groups throughout American history into the present. But again, understanding the process, right, the kind of mechanical and repeating process through time. Why is it that we have certain groups, whether it be women or African Americans or indigenous people or whatever it happens to be, a Mexican Americans like myself, right? Why do we have these ongoing, social, racial, political issues? And what are the processes that underlie those, and explain them? And once we understand that, then we can address it, like I said, and start to fix it. And so that point, I think, is really important. We tend to personalize and individualize everything as if, you're to blame for 19th century genocide against or attempted genocide against natives. You're obviously not, right? You weren't there, that kind of thing. But you can do something about what's going on now, right? And you can understand how what happened in the past has created a position that you or I or anyone else inhabits, and I think that's the real importance of history. It's that we come into this world and then we're taught that, what you do as an individual is kind of the dominant motive, the dominant driving force of what happens in the world. And, from my perspective, that's just not true. It's not that what you do isn't important, but it's that the world is a lot bigger than all of us, right? And that there are these forces that we are born into that are shaping our experiences. And, they help explain why we do what we do. And again, it's for me, I want to figure out what are those forces that are shaping our lives. And then how can we as a species, that inhabits this world with other species, how can we, understand those forces and use our own agency, though it be limited, use it to again, create improvement, and so that's where my teaching is coming from. And I try to get away from blame and guilt and all those negative things that are not helpful and that just keep us divided and separated. Because I think the divide and conquer, paradigm is vital to why and how we continue to have all the issues that we have, right? So, that's a long-winded answer to your comment, but that's where I come down.
Right. It is a interesting, I guess, thought process that man has when it comes to power and how far they'd be willing to go to divide and conquer, essentially. I mean, I don't know the number. I've only heard rough estimates. I've heard, 100 million. I've heard, tens of millions. I don't know what the number is, but they did a lot of killing of indigenous people here just to colonize it, just in the name of freedom. So, and that's just here in the U.S. It's been done places all over the world before then, and it's still going on now. So it's one of the more, it's a form of extreme human behavior, which isn't my quote. It's the famous George Carlin. He had a bit where he talks about all different kinds of this, more of the crazy things that we as humans do that animals don't really do. And that's one of them. The fact that we have this craving to control a land and to put a border up and to make this ours. Because that ours thing only comes from an ego. It comes from that place of individuality, because only that one guy is like, hey, I want this, so let's get this community and do our thing here. And it is strange. It's strange. It's something that you'd think evolution would have taken care of. We'd stop thinking about that. At least that's what you'd think. But
yeah, totally. Yeah, no, and it's not, in terms of human history, it's not normal. In other words, it's not what you see most often, right? So in other words, this kind of extreme individualism that you see, it gets discussed obviously in earlier than when it becomes a reality. But you start seeing discussions of liberalism, again, classical liberalism in the 17th century, right? And then obviously by the 18th century, it comes to the fore with the Enlightenment, then again with the introduction of capitalism in the 18th century, again, which is, focused on an individual's ability to profit, obviously. It becomes central to Western civilization by the time, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, et cetera. But it's not the notion that we are these atomized individuals moving through the world, doing our thing, is not the most common way that humans have understood the world by any means. It's new, it's rare, right? And again, there is a lot about it that is deeply destructive because when you start to think logically about the kind of the power of the individual or setting up a world, your vision of the world predicated on the individual, you see fallacies in it right away, right? For example, none of us, we only come into the world because of the community of two people, right? Get together, right? So that we can be conceived and then born. If we die, we only live on because of other people keep our memory alive, right? If there's loads and loads of video of our lives or pictures, but there's no one around to see it, we are in essence gone. We only continue because of community. Everything that we do while we're alive is connected to other people. The language that we speak and hence thinking, that's all that language. We didn't make up that language, right? So on this kind of very basic level, there is this really important limitation in terms of what individualism is and can be. And it's not that there isn't individuality. It's not that there isn't exactly the person as a unit, but it's just that the way our society kind of places the individual as the kind of center driving agent of society and the central building block of the civilization, I think is deeply problematic. Precisely because it aligns and cuts these connections that we have with each other in this kind of, in a way, psychopathic way, right? In the sense of moving in the world, living in the world in a way that in which we think, we get up, we wake up in the morning, we think, what do I want to do? What do I need to do? How can I have fun? How can I be more comfortable, right? And then of course other people become again instruments to that in a lot of ways. And again, that's a problem for all kinds of reasons, but it makes us, it not only silos us in terms of us as people and individuals, but it silos us in terms of groups, right? And once you have that, then you have a recipe for intergroup conflict. And again, the ability for powerful forces to use different groups against each other in ways that prevent us from, again, like I said, making real positive and revolutionary change. So again, the history of how and why that is so is deeply important because a lot of us, again, just enter the world and then are taught that this is the way that it is, right? In other words, this is how humans are. We are these, we are beings that are individuals, see the world that way, and that's how it is and has always been, and that's just not true. And when you learn that, again, it opens up all kinds of new possibilities for us, particularly to address, the issues that we are facing today, right? Even, you can even think of things like, the politicalization of mask wearing, for example, right? Why did that happen? Well, one reason it happened is because, when you put on a mask, you are literally self-effacing, right? You're literally covering your face, the marker of yourself, right? And that gets to the core of how we're taught to be in the world. We're taught to be that we are individuals in the world. We are the masters of our own destiny. And so we extol and we celebrate our selfness. And putting a mask on is the literal opposite of that. And that is one, again, reason why it's become politicized. It's not because people are crazy. It's not because they don't know what's good for, it's because it's deeply uncomfortable to be forced and faced, no pun intended, faced with having to move about in the world with this obvious marker of your own kind of not only self-effacement, but the weakness of your own self as an individual. Your weakness in the sense of your ability to I don't know, contend with the virus, right? That kind of thing. So again, I bring that up just to say and underscore the point that given the kind of earth-shaking changes that are happening to our society, right? Again, while they seem overwhelming and again, like I said, potentially very, very dark, on the other hand, they give us these opportunities for understanding and then moving forward in a more positive way.
Right. Yeah. The idea of being an individual in a community is something that I guess might be revered. Somebody who kind of stands out. Somebody who's a little different. And some people really stand on that. Some people are, that's their identity. That's what makes them them. And a lot of the times, we don't realize that a community can actually change the person. It can change their identity, because how often do you see a bright, happy college graduate go out into the world, and then 5 years later they're like, ugh, their shoulders are drudged over, or you see it a lot with new teachers, elementary school teachers, and that type of thing. They're putting stuff all over the walls, and they're ready. They have all these ideas. We're going to do this, and all these stations, and then so many years in, they kind of lose it, and it shows, and vice versa. You can have an awful person and put them in a good situation, a good community, and it changes them. So there really is a real strength in community, for good or for bad.
Exactly. Yeah. No. I mean, it's exactly true, and it's harder for us as Americans, I would say broadly, to deal with that, because again, we are taught that our individuality is so revered, right? Is so important. That when communities that we belong to affect us in ways we don't like, we see that as at best, I guess, an imposition, but at worst, a deep threat to who we are. Right? And so yeah, it's a problem. But it's I tell my students that we have all these like horrific things that we have to deal with. For kids today, not the debt that they're faced with going to college, the inability to get high paying jobs when they leave, the ecological and climate crisis. On and on and on. But again, I'm not I don't try to instill like a bunch of hope into students, but rather the idea of doing things, of acting in ways that can lead to hopefully, then a better near future, rather than being overwhelmed with, the kind of, again, the conditions that they're born into, right? It's not their fault. They didn't create a world in which they have to take out a bunch of loans, or their family does for school, right? But at the same time, they have to go to school to have a chance of getting a decent job, right? They didn't create that world, but they have to contend with it. So understanding that you either get overwhelmed by it or you act, and again, going back to martial arts, right? How many times have I been overwhelmed by guys that are bigger, stronger, and better than me, all the time, right? But you keep acting and you keep going, and in doing so, you feel better. And often, sometimes, you make a better position for yourself. And so, that's what I want my students to kind of lead my courses with. This idea of the antidote to the crap that you have to deal with that's no fault of your own is action on your part. And then from that, you can have hope if you want after. But the acting is what's going to give you the ability, or the chance of having something better. So, it's a bizarre and historical moment that we live in, but again, also one with deep, deep possibility and opportunity. So I just, I'm interested to see what happens. I hope that as we move forward, we don't have a bunch of violence, because it could obviously go that way. But I hope not.
Right. Yeah. And incredibly bizarre. We have everything we could ever need, more or less, at our fingertips. That's never happened in history. I mean, if you wanted to learn anything, you had to go somewhere. You don't have to go anywhere now. You want to watch something, you want to watch a performance, you could do it right from your house. It is a very interesting time. And I'm only 24 years old, so this is all I know. This is, I guess I came up in the generation that started without this kind of technology and kind of grew into it, which is, I think, good for us because we get to see both sides. But yeah, I mean, there is immense potential, but there's also immense possibility for some bad stuff to happen. Now, I myself am not a huge historian, which is part of the reason why I wanted to get you on here. Anytime I have the opportunity to learn about anything, especially something I'm interested in, like native culture, I don't know much about it. So I did do a smidgen of research before this, and it seems like before I wasn't able to find much in terms of colonization before when Christopher Columbus kind of came around. Is there any record of other peoples coming over and either trying to colonize or trying to become allies with the natives?
Record, no, but the peopling of the Americas is kind of this holy grail in archaeology. What we know is that there were probably people in the Americas earlier than is commonly taught. And there were probably several waves of people coming into the Americas. And again, I'm not a real specialist on this, but from what I've read from people who are specialists, that's kind of where the archaeology and everything is going. There has been recent improvements in understanding through DNA kind of sequencing and that sort of stuff. But yeah, no. In terms of colonization, no, we don't know anything prior to at least in the Americas, to European colonization happening. There are obviously things like the Aztecs or something who would have at least taken over other indigenous peoples, but no one new coming in from other parts of the world and then colonizing in the Americas. But like I said, we do think that there are at least a few waves of peoples coming into the Americas. Now, I do have to add though that for indigenous people, they and their people have always been here. That's the idea. They emerge from the land itself. And I bring that up because, again, it is broadly the native way of understanding their origins. It doesn't really matter to them if there were people who came to the Americas from Asia, for example, because the kind of birth of their community, right, and their ancestors is something that's forged in America, right? So whether or not there are people coming in before that or not is pretty immaterial. And in the sense of the history that is told within indigenous communities about, our people came from this part of the land, this mound, or this cave or the ocean or whatever it happens to be. In terms of kind of a Western understanding of that, What it correlates to is the development of this indigenous community. So, whatever it happens to be, Narragansetts or Neantics or Pequots or Wampanoags or, Bokonokets, whatever. Those people are born, created, etc. in America, and that's because the community that they know, right, both historically as well as into the present, is in fact forged in America, and that's important for all kinds of reasons. But the main reason I bring it up now is to show that is to, again, to decolonize, as we say, our understanding of the history. And by decolonize, I mean to privilege indigenous ways of being, seen, the world, their cultural values, etc., in the center of that history. And so that for again, the indigenous peoples I know, as well as the groups I've studied, that's how they understand their origins in America. And so I repeat that now. So I'll stop there.
Right. So it seems from some of the stuff that I've read, it seems like the real bad, like the real bloodshed, it seems like that started to go on around the 1800s. Like, is that accurate, where the real, like, kind of war started to come through?
Not necessarily, right? Because so it depends where and when you're talking about, right? But right. No, I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at it, or to kind of mark that. You could, so for example, I mean, with the Spanish conquest of the Americas, there's bloodshed from the start. I mean, and in a lot of ways that there would have been more in certain areas had the European the Europeans arriving would have, if they had the power, there would have been more earlier. You could also look at it as, for example, in our neck of the woods right here in southern New England, I mean, you have pandemics going through indigenous communities ahead of English settlement in the area, wiping out half the Wampanoags, for example, in certain areas. And in fact, it's for that reason that the Pilgrims, right, are helped and welcomed by Massasoit in 1620, as he wanted new allies against that he could use to strengthen his community after population losses from epidemics. So you could look at the bloodshed that way. I mean, in terms of the United States, right? You could also make the argument that the creation of the United States is a tremendous problem, a horrific outcome for Native peoples, because again, it's built on this liberal premise, which then necessitates a ramping up of indigenous dispossession. So and this ongoing warfare that you see in the 18th through 19th centuries, and now on into the 20th century. The same could be true, for Canada, but a little bit different. But the general process of violence being used against indigenous peoples in the 18th and 19th century, that's in the kind of Anglophone world, that is that's true of all of North America. So yeah, I mean, it's bad in a lot of ways, no matter how, when, and where you look at it. And again, a lot of that has to do with the ways in which these kind of visions of the world, right, that Europeans are bringing with them as they come to America, from the get-go, right? The idea of coming to America for economic gain, the idea of coming to America for, personal liberation from kind of the vestiges of paternal and, before that, feudal relationships in Europe, right? In other words, where you were kind of, if you weren't in, elite circles, you were subject to the kind of power and will of all kinds of social superiors, in Europe. The attempt to try to escape that, which are seen as various forms of enslavement by Europeans who are leaving, Europe. Those all set the stage for what happens with Indigenous people, right? In other words, when you're coming to America to make money, to, spread the word of, whether you're, Protestant or Catholic, if you're coming to America to escape the bonds of, paternal European societies, all of those then translate to some form of either, kind of exploitation, extirpation, or, again, genocide of Indigenous peoples as you attempt to realize your goal, So in other words, if you're coming to America to get land and be free, right? You got to get rid of the people who are already on the land, I mean, it's as simple as that. And so, or if you're coming to America to spread the word, you got to get rid of what people already think. I mean, and so in these very basic, simple ways that get complicated in all kinds of, attempts to justify, legitimize, or somehow change the history, right? Those get lost. The very simple kind of forces that are at play get lost. And so, the bloodshed and the problems, it's there from the beginning. And yes, do you see, kind of an acceleration of those at certain times? Absolutely. In the context of the United States, absolutely. You see in the 19th, well, really from the beginning of the nation on, into the, late 19th century, you see, increasing use of war, of all kinds to again deal with what they see as the Indian problem. And that can be things like, asymmetrical warfare, right? The targeting of non-combatants and food supplies, that's done right, from very, very early on. And with the United States from the very beginning, that kind of stuff's done right away, so it's a problem, definitely.
Right. Now, you mentioned a lot of the motives for them coming here is looking for land and looking for freedom and all these different things. And that kind of kickstarted this genocide, this colonization that we're talking about. As time goes on and they started to see a little bit more success, do you think that motives may have changed? Do you think that there started to become maybe an inherent dislike toward the people, and it started to go a little in a different direction?
Sure. I mean, yeah, the simple answer is yes. I mean, but there are all kinds of ways that plays out depending on, again, where and when you're talking about. So the movement, like, again, in the in the U.S. context, right, to natives as this kind of racialized other, in the sense of being these kind of dangerous savages, that they're racialized as. That, I mean, dependent on how you market, I mean, that begins, you see variants of that from the start. There's times in history when it becomes, more front and center. It becomes re-articulated in stronger ways. So after Metacom's War, for example, the 1670s, you see this kind of explosion of painting natives as these untrustworthy, bloodthirsty people that are going to, be violent no matter what. I mean, there's this kind of casting the war in the aftermath of the war in this way in the writings that you see in the late 17th century, particularly in New England. So that happens. There's ways of kind of painting during westward expansion, for example, painting native peoples as nomadic in ways that are meant to undercut the idea that they can become incorporated into the United States, right? So there's things like prior to the large removal movements in the 1830s and 40s, whether this be, in the South with the Cherokees and Choctaws and others, or in the North with, the Hautestonis or whoever it happens to be, there is this notion that Native peoples are still, hunters, right? Still not civilized, right? Even though, of course, they have they have farms, they have churches, they have schools, right? All of that is kind of just brushed aside in the name of creating this kind of racialized other. So, you do get points in history where there are purposeful attempts to, again, paint a picture of Native peoples as a particular with a particular brush in ways that make colonization easier. Where I live in Connecticut, for example, you see you see things like calling into question Native people's indigenous identities in the late 17th century as a way to dispossess them, saying, well, you can't have this reserved land because you're not really Native, that kind of thing. So again, it just depends, I would say today in our present moment, there's still a lot of, and this is a holdover from the latter part of the 20th century, there's still a lot of the idea that Indians are not real Indians anymore, like I was talking about before. If they hunt from motorized boats, for example, you hear, bizarre things like this. They hunt from motorized boats. Well, that's not really, that you can't really, or fish, from motorized boats. You can't really be a real Indian, right? So there's this weird kind of historical, historicized, I guess, picture of natives as, again, being locked in what one historian has called colonial time, the past, where the only real Indians reside, and that's just a more sophisticated way of again, controlling, subordinating, containing Native people in ways that justify ongoing colonization.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All these things that we're talking about are terrible, really bad. But there's one thing that I've always admired about Native Americans, something that, for lack of a better term, is just really badass. It's the idea that they're fighting a war, they're fighting against people who are oppressing them, they're taking their land, they're doing all these terrible things to them, knowing that they're probably going to lose. Mm-hmm. They don't have the technology, they don't have the manpower, all these things. They know they're going to lose, but they're going to fight. Like, they're going to take as many of them as they can with them. And, being a martial artist and being someone who sees value in that type of thing, someone who's not going to go down with a fight or without a fight. It's something very admirable when I look at the culture. And there's actually, you may be familiar with them. I don't know how much you follow the UFC, but there was a gentleman who was fighting for them. I think he had a couple fights. He ended up fighting out of his contract, but his name is Brock Weaver, and he's actually he's Native American heritage, and he wears that out there. He comes out with the paint and the headdress and all that stuff, and he might lose and he might win and whatever happens, but he's fighting the whole time, and it bleeds through, and it's such an admirable thing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there are times when that happens, right? Where in the physical sense, where you've got indigenous peoples, fighting and continuing to fight. And then you have times when the fight's over, the physical fight is over, but the struggle continues in all kinds of ways. Um, so, for example, like with all the protests with the Keystone Pipeline a few years ago, when the indigenous peoples, were leading that protest, right? That was nonviolent, civil resistance, nonviolent direct action. And you see that all around the world now with indigenous people fighting in this way, which is super important. It is, again, I mean, I'm a big believer in nonviolent direct action, right? And even though I am a martial artist, right, and even though I do understand the physical fight, but at a certain point, you do need to, also deal with the non-physical element of the struggle, and I think any kind of successful social or revolutionary movement has done that, right? And yeah, but Native peoples continue to do that today. I mean, that is what they do in lots of ways. Other than it's part of their simple existence, right? It's part of their simple being, on the land. And important to understand, I would say, is the idea that, again, when you live in a world built on interconnection and relationships, right, you understand that you cannot disconnect your group entirely from what's going on with the other people that also inhabit the world that you inhabit. And so that's another reason, another motivation as to why Native peoples continue to engage with, for example, not only the dominant society, but the government of the United States or state governments or whatever it happens to be. So, for example, I know that the Pokanokets were just involved with the town of Warren's land declaration, right? So the town of Warren just passed this acknowledgement that they reside on Pokanoket land, and the Pokanokets were involved with this, with bringing this to the fore. And so they're directly interacting with a group that is, or with an entity in the city or the town that is, the physical manifestation of the colonial process. But in doing so, they're bringing to light in this really open and public way the ongoing nature of colonization, and that's important. And that sort of struggle, that sort of fight that the Native peoples are bringing to are bringing to the fore in this example is a prime example of that ongoing kind of struggle that just doesn't end, that you keep working. And it's important, because they understand, as do most Indigenous people I know, they understand that if their world is going to be better and they're going to be healthier, then the people that they're connected to need to be engaged with, right? And so it's often there isn't this. It goes beyond just kind of this idea of we need to keep fighting. It's that we need to keep fighting because it's the healthiest thing to do for all of us, right? Sure. To work with these people who, again, could be the physical manifestation of ongoing colonization, the example I just mentioned. So yeah, no, it is admirable and important. It helps us all, to tell you the truth. It helps us all. We're all healthier. We're all better for it. And that makes it even more admirable, I would say.
Yes. Yeah. Now, as we start to wrap this thing up, one question I had is what I guess organizations are in place, and what can people do to kind of get more involved? And I think the first step is always informing yourself. So maybe listening to this podcast, or
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
maybe getting your book, right? Maybe that's the first step.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
but after that, what more is there to do once you become informed?
Oh God. Okay. So that's a great question, and it's really, really important. Well, you asked first about organizations. There is the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. You can get involved with that. They do excellent work on decolonization and Indigenous issues. There could be all kinds of local opportunities in terms of organizational opportunities, or simply kind of connecting with Indigenous people in whatever area that you live. I think in terms of a concrete, better kind of, or another concrete answer to your question is to be open. What can you do? You can inform yourself, as you said. You can learn how things work, and then you can be open, first off, to change, giving things up, right? And then acting on that, on those sorts of changes. In other words, getting involved with any kind of issue in your area that is important to the Indigenous peoples in your area. So I mentioned the Poconokeets. Getting involved with the returning Patumtuk, the seat of Metacom, for example, their sacred area for their communal leaders, right? This is owned now by Brown, but getting access to that area, helping getting involved maybe with that fight. Right. I mentioned Keystone XL. So, a couple of years ago, getting involved with that sort of protest, that kind of, again, nonviolent direct action in any regard, I think is generally positive. But yeah, I think on a personal level, it's being open to the idea that maybe what you have been taught or promised is not going to come to fruition in the same way. If we make a better world for all of us, we're not, maybe we're not going to become billionaires, but that's okay. Right. Maybe we're not going to own 3 homes, but that's okay. That kind of thing. Being willing to give up some of these kind of dreams of massive material wealth. It might mean giving up particularly understandings of your racial or ethnic identity, right? In the way of saying things like, I don't know, giving up on the idea that if you're part of a particular group, it means this, and this. I think as we move forward, and again, hopefully, and as things start to change, our very understandings of who we are going to be influenced by that. And I think being open to that and willing to be uncomfortable in that process is vital. I mean, just super important. We can't, if we kind of recoil in this reactionary way into our positions that we want to defend, we're just going to continue to fight with no positive progress forward. And so I think kind of realizing that we as individuals are gonna have to be uncomfortable with things. Again, whether it be economic, social, identity wise, whatever, is really, really key. So that's
right.
what I would say. Yeah.
Right. It starts with a lot of
to be uncomfortable. Yeah.
Sure. A lot of self-realization, kind of unlearning some of the things that we've been led to believe. Which is life. I mean, a lot of that stuff happens all the time,
Yeah, exactly.
So
but we get so much more in return. I mean, it's just, living a life of purpose that's connected to what you can do for other people, right, is what makes us, content, I think. And I think this is well known with a lot of cultures all around the world, and we've forgotten that. And we try to find contentment in the pursuit of self-interest, which is, fine if it's one thing that you're doing, but it can't be. We all need, or most of us need, some sort of selfless kind of sacrifice. We're doing something for other people or another person or other groups, and that gives us meaning and purpose and contentment. And I think being willing to do that at the expense of, at least partially, of some of the things that we've been promised about, our own personal things that we would get, right? Whether it be, again, economic stuff or identity elements or political elements or whatever, that's important.
Right. And that's something I actually talk about more or less fairly often. The idea behind doing something as a job, you work, you make money, or doing something that truly connects with you on a different level, whether it be spiritual or emotionally. It makes you, like you were saying, you're doing something for other people. You're doing something for another community, and it makes you feel a certain way about it. And if you can mesh the two, if you can do that and make money off of it, then what more do you want?
There you go, man. That's it. Yeah,
right.
No, absolutely.
So where can people find your book? I know you had mentioned the title. What's it called again? Where can people find it?
It's Native American Roots is the title. You can find it either on Amazon or Routledge.com, the press. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, awesome.
Well, all right, guys, we're all set. Thank you all so much for listening. Professor Christian Gonzales, thank you so much for coming on and schooling us.
Thank you. No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity, and it's great to meet you.
Awesome. All right, guys. Talk to you soon. Peace.